Okay, so I'm kind of continuing on from Marx, and in fact probably also from the earlier ones. But I've been asked to talk about work we've been doing, which we, Katrine Bone and myself, looking at this idea of productive urban landscapes and a project that we call a few years back laboratories for urban agriculture, looking at how urban agriculture and the idea of productive landscape can come into rethinking of the city. And this idea of the laboratory for urban agriculture is the notion that a lot of the projects we look at are ones where urban agriculture, thus productive landscape, have been put into cities in a way which is pragmatic and not particularly sort of planned or designed. But by looking at those, we think it's possible to try and imagine what this city with a productive landscape would be like. Now, what Karen's asked me to talk about is more the kind of politics and governance around these spaces. So that's what this talk is about. And it's focused on work I did 2 summers ago visiting the United States. So it's a very kind of partial view from somebody who's visiting a place with a particular focus. And it's not comprehensive, but it'll give an overview of some ideas around politics and governance of these space. And just to start, I'll just show you what we mean by productive landscapes. And actually this image, which is sort of becoming fairly, one could say sort of iconic in the way it's being used, I thought was really interesting in relation to what Mark was saying about the Ford workers and Detroit, and the collapse of Detroit and industry, and actually people not being able to continue the functioning of the city or the society almost. Because this is an image from 2002, which is taken in a place called Cienfuegos, which is on the southern coast of Cuba. And it's one which captures the essence of what in Cuba are called organoponicos, which are basically urban market gardens. But taking it back to Mark's comment, the thing about Cuba is that the economy collapsed, but it had a very highly educated population. So although materially it had pretty well nothing, really pretty well nothing, there was quite a skilled and educated population who kind of tried to cobble things together. And this picture, when I showed it to the English artist Tom Phillips, who we sometimes work with, he saw it. He said, that's the image of the revolution succeeding even when it's failing. And it captures, I think, that sort of idea of sort of a notion of sustainability. Anyway, that's quite a key image for this idea of a productive landscape of a particular type. And the other, which is a much more recent one, this is from last summer, is a project that Katrine is running in a place called Marzahn, which is a big East German suburb built on the outskirts of Berlin, which is again an urban agriculture project, but in this case much more one about trying to engage a community with a discussion about what to do with this area in Marzahn. And this is running for now about 2 years. And this is very much a kind of European model of a type of, let's say, productive landscape, which is about food production, but is very much about trying to engage people in a dialogue about the future of spaces. And just to say, I mean, this whole notion of urban agriculture and productivity and how it can come into the city is something which is gaining a lot of momentum. I mean, our studio knows all about that, but it's one of these things which in the last few years has really kind of moved from the fringe to something that is kind of at the center of a discussion about cities. Now, the thing about it is it's incredibly complex in that it touches on many, many different aspects of life, profession, societies. And so it can be quite hard to pin down exactly where one fits into it. So one of the things we've been looking at in the studio is this idea of what we call inventories of urban capacity, which is trying to understand how different players, different sites, different individuals, institutions kind of together contribute to this sort of through a series of interdependencies to food systems and place and space, all of which result in ways of thinking about how you might, through a series of actions, start enabling this kind of productivity in a city. So that's just really background to where this work comes from. Now I'm going to talk about United States and urban agriculture and this project Laboratories for Urban Agriculture. And the thing to say is it's happening. And probably the most sort of iconic images from the States are ones like this, which are from New York, and this is a place called Eagle Wharf Rooftop Farm on the edge of the river Manhattan. In the distance there's the United Nations building, I think. These spaces are appearing really across the states, but they take many different forms, and I'm going to try and talk about the different kind of, let's say, politics around the way these are formed. And in fact, I think I subtitled this sort of politics and governance. I mean, what I wanted to say was there's a lot of politics and there's some governance, by which I mean there's a lot of kind of activity, agency, sort of action going on to make these projects happen. And in some cities like New York, Milwaukee, various ones, there's quite a lot of support, which we call the kind of sort of governance side, from the cities to facilitate these. In other places, there's not. But so this image kind of sums up the sort of New York rooftop farm. This is Ben Falmer, who runs one of the most well-publicized projects, which is called Brooklyn Grange Rooftop Farm, which is actually in Queens. And it's a very, very successful project. It's also a very beautiful space. But these projects, I kind of describe them as being run by sort of media-savvy young graduates. I mean, these are people who really set these projects up. They want to do them, and they make them happen. I mean, he's got a background in farming, in finance, and he's also set up the farm. But the farm operates with a lot of quite young collaborators. There are about 5 people who run it. They remind me most of our visual and performing arts students who kind of know what they want to do. They kind of go out and do it, but for example, half the people working on this farm, of those 5, will talk about having their job, which is running the farm, and then they'll talk about a rent job. They'll say, my job is the farm, and then I have a rent job working in a bar 3 days a week, and that pays, the rent. So these are kind of emerging projects, and they are very much these kind of multi-program projects. So this rooftop farm, for example, produces food, sells it, runs markets, but it also uses the space for kind of banquets and parties and events, and there's a big educational aspect to it. It's very similar to the Berlin project some of us saw, Prinzessinnengarten, except that it's more focused on productivity than Prinzessinnengarten would be. So this type of farming is happening. It's beginning to expand very rapidly, and it is very entrepreneurial. I mean, the people know what they want to do, they could do it and set the things up. They find the land. They get a whole team around them of architects, engineers, finance people to support them, often by giving advice, doing consultancy work, and getting a share in the profits of the project when it becomes profitable. And this is another type. I mean, all three of these images I've shown you, you can reach within like sort of half an hour's walk in Queens. And this is a much more commercial operation, rooftop farm, set up as a business using hydroponics on the roof of a industrial building. And this is the other approach, entirely commercial, entirely driven by trying to supply local restaurants at this stage mainly with food. But these are very significant projects, and architecturally, maybe these are also, not maybe, but they have this particular quality. Of course, they're quite lightweight physically, so they're quite appropriate for a number of building types. But now we're going to go back to Detroit, and this is really like just a little summary file quickly put in. There's a big project called Detroit Works, which is going on, which is a proposal to develop a strategy for the city in the future. And it's just been published. It includes a whole number of aspects, including urban farming. But I've kind of paraphrased this by saying Detroit Works sometimes, and sometimes it will like you, because what I took from a fairly superficial sort of, what is probably a fairly superficial view, but was the city is very, very different to, let's say, a British city in that most of the land belongs to the city. So if you look at London, you know, the land doesn't belong to the city, so it's very difficult for city authorities to actually do anything of their own initiative. However, the city has no money, so it can't do anything. So what happens is you have a lot of grassroots organizations who are quite kind of political. You then also have more kind of structured organizations who tend to get funding from foundations. So, for example, Detroit Works, this big design program, has been funded by the Kellogg's Foundation and the Kreska Foundation. These are charities. So that means in the end that if the charity likes you, or if you meet their criteria, you can get funding and you can do something. So it's not a particularly kind of democratic way of working, but it's a way that a huge number of projects across the board operate, and it's very different to the sort of, let's say, European sense of why or how you might try going about something. And in a way, just to give a flavour of Detroit in relation to urban agriculture, because it's quite a big activity over there. We have all these different groups. You have a group called the Greening of Detroit, very political, very kind of community-driven, very hardcore green. You have Eastern Market, this amazing project, which is operating from within the city's old fruit and vegetable market. You have a project called Earthworks, the Capuchin Kitchen, run by a religious order, which has transformed a whole street, but I mean quite significant street, and basically feeds people who have no access to food, down and outs. Seedwayne Market, that's part of the university. You have a very political organization called the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, and they run a project called D-Farm, which is both about food growing but very political as well. And then you have kind of corporate projects that are active, and probably the most visible one is here on the left, which is a project set up by a company called CompuWare, who've taken over a derelict site, set up a productive garden producing food that their employees work on. The food goes to food banks, employees use it. It operates in the city, and it's one of the few spaces that have been designed by a designer. When we go back into the city, I wanted to put this picture in because this kind of captures something of the kind of slight bizarreness. I mean, not slight, but like the absolute kind of craziness of Detroit. So, if you look at this picture, it's like one of many we've seen. But if you look at it carefully, you'll see that here is a textured paving slab, which is for disabled access. So this part of the town currently, and you can see this is very new concrete. Yeah? It had 2 years ago, it had all these pavements laid in this suburb, which is collapsing because I had a budget which was available for sort of municipal improvement and pavement, and they had to use it by such a time, and they've installed it, in this area which used to be a suburb and which is composting. I mean, the great thing about Detroit's suburbs is that the houses are wooden, so they either let them. I mean, this is now again simplifying, but they either let them burn down. They've stopped putting out the fires for most of them because it costs too much money. And if you don't put out the fires, they literally just compost, and you get this prairie coming back. So in a way, you can see quite easily what would happen if you just left most of it. It'll just revert back to a fairly natural state, in sort of natural in inverted commas, I guess. Anyway, that's a typical context of suburban Detroit. I mean, the other thing is Detroit's very big. We hear these statistics about how many cities you could put into it. Actually, downtown Detroit, the city is very small. The center of Detroit, which built up, which has got office blocks and towers, you can walk like in half an hour. In an hour, you can walk from the edge of it into the center, but kind of nobody does. So actually, it's quite a compact city if you wanted it to be. But the sort of notion of it is that it's huge because it has a lot of suburbia, but the suburbia is pretty well composting. I mean, what the problem with it is that there are all these isolated little areas that remain with people living in them, and people are possessive, of where they live, and so there's a real kind of problem between the notion of what you could do with it, if you think of it, as a design sort of opportunity or problem, and the reality of individuals living, within this place, which is home. So to get back to the productive landscapes, one of the projects which is kind of most active and is interesting and is working with a very particular demographic is this project called Earthworks. And this is a picture, just complete chance, when I was visiting them, where you can see there's a TV boom, and they're being filmed, showing what they do, and it's a program about honey they're producing and various things. But these projects got a huge amount of publicity, and this is a very, very good project run by very kind of committed people, which basically has taken over a street which is called Meldrum, suburban street, and they've set up a series of market gardens on the street, and basically they feed homeless people. But apart from feeding people, they also operate a whole load of community programs, health-related ones, soup kitchen, various things. and they've actually this makes it look like very beautiful and it's Arcadian really. It's a street with a lot of houses that are collapsing, and they slowly take over plots which are farmed, produce food. And what's interesting about it is the people who consume this food would be down and out, no homes, no money, nothing. Yeah, come in, get the food. But most of the farming is actually done by volunteers who come in, and this is a bunch of students from the university, from medical school. There's still a big medical school in Detroit, and they come and work on the farm along with lots of other people. And so they operate quite a lot of these plants, which are producing actually a good quantity of food. So that's one strand of kind of project happening in Detroit, which is kind of driven by, let's say, a very sort of charitable and social sort of driver for the projects. And there are many more, and there are many complexions of these, so that this is like it is really a summary. Now, if we then jump back into Detroit and into the center of the town, and we do a kind of little walkthrough, which goes back to a slide that Mark had. This is what's called the DeQuindra Cut. And this is one of the most interesting potentials in the city, at least from our point of view, for this idea of the continuous productive landscape, because slowly you can see something beginning to emerge that might remain and might actually start building something in the city. So if we imagine the city, this building over here, this is one of Mies van der Rohe's towers from Lafayette Park, which is this very intact and very sort of beautiful modernist suburb, kind of carpet buildings, 2 slabs, completely intact, manicured, perfect, and you can live there, and it operates as an island. And the one thing that's checked is that you have enough money in your bank account to live there, so you can pay the maintenance costs. That's the criteria for getting a low-rise museum house. But anyway, this cut, what's interesting about it is this was an old railway line, and where you're sitting would be the riverfront of Detroit, and this railway then ran towards about here, where there is this market, which is called Eastern Market, which happens here. And this image I find quite key. This guy, his name is Dan Commody, and he is a planner, and he's also worked in property development, and he runs this market, and he is kind of instrumental in creating a piece of public space in the city, which is food related. And in a way, this image reminds me of a very old piece of music by Laurie Anderson, who some of you might know, some of you may not, which is called Big Science. And she's got this great song in it from like 1980s or something, which is talking about somebody wanting direction for somewhere in the States. And it's all about, well, you walk down the street and you turn left where they're thinking about building the supermarket, and then you go along to where there used to be the petrol filling station, turn left there. And it's all about this kind of like imagined landscape. And this is a bit like this, because the DeQuindra Cut, which we've just seen, runs along here under this bridge. And that has been developed by a series of sort of citizens, corporate bodies, etc., etc. It's been funded by by citizens as this bit of landscape, this park, which has come into the city, and it's going to connect to this road here. And I'm not going to show you lots of slides, but over here, there's a 2-acre urban agriculture farm, being set up by one of these organizations called the Greening of Detroit, which is a pilot project for training new urban farmers. And that's, was literally being built 2 years ago. We then go down here, and the actual market is here. And this market operates 2 days a week for the public, on a Saturday and on a Wednesday. And it is, in my view, it's the only piece of public space in the city. It's the only piece of space which isn't somehow kind of privatized or very corporate. It demonstrates what we would call, and other people would call, this idea of the kind of convening power of food. So every Saturday, this opens. Dan Commody, who runs the market, invites anybody who grows or produces food to come in there and sell it. And it's very like Market Halle 9, which we went to visit in Berlin, but much bigger. But the most amazing thing is that all along the edge of the market, bars and restaurants open up, and they're not like very fashionable or very polished, but they just open up their barbecues, and most amazingly, they just invade the street. So suddenly, in Detroit, the sort of city of the car, the cars have to negotiate all these people that are occupying the street, and it's an amazing space which captures for me what the sort of idea of one of the ideas of the productive landscape would be in terms of this convening power of food. But within it, if we go back then to the different ways people are practicing urban agriculture in the city, this is probably one of the sort of, let's say, greenest farmers in the city, somebody called Carolyn Ledby, and she runs a farm called Rising Pheasant Farm, and she cultivates everything herself. It's cultivated sort of organically by hand, and it's all transported using bicycle convoys. And her partner runs a bicycle co-op, and they've constructed these special trailers for moving all their goods to and from the market. And this one is also partly for cut flowers. Because one of the interesting things about urban agriculture, I mean, in terms of it being about production, but also about like a quality of life, is that, for example, they grow cut flowers as well as food. And one of the things in Cuba, which I always found very interesting, was they had their organoponicos, which are food production, but then they would also have what they would call floral organoponicos, which would be basically horticultural sites that would grow cut flowers for weddings and birthdays. So, I mean, within that kind of collapse, there was still the whole idea of food and celebration, which you can get a little hint of here. Now, this is Carolyn Ledby's farm, and basically and that's her house. So she bought that house for very little money, and they slowly doing it up. I mean, you can buy houses for very little, but they're fairly wrecked. I mean, they've got to do quite a lot of work to get that up and running. And what farmers like her are doing are just basically squatting empty sites, and they cultivate them, and nobody stops them cultivating them because there's no infrastructure to kind of police the land. The city, in a way, is very pleased that I think somebody's doing something with it. So you have a strand of farmers who work like Carolyn Ledby, who are very kind of committed to organic growing, to this working with the city, working in a very particular way. And then you have another layer of people who are operating at a much larger level. And this chap, whose name is Gary Wozniak, is part of an organization called the Shah Foundation, which is an organization which is working with people who are recovering from various kinds of addiction. and they have a big project which is called Recovery Park, and they are setting up, they want to set up a large urban agriculture farm within the city that will then work with people who are trying to sort of re-establish themselves after recovering from various kind of addictions, this, that, and the other. And this is like a very, very ambitious project, which is very hard to quite work out how it's ever going to happen. But there are great kind of plans and designs done with architects from one of the local schools of architecture. There's funding from a foundation again. And now I don't think those are the same buildings you showed me. They are, okay. So this is like typical in a way, it's like the Detroit story. So these buildings from Gary Wozniak's car are part of Recovery Park's proposal for introducing an urban farm into the city. And they want to, and they are, talking with Dutch organizations at the moment, people who are developing LED, liquid crystal display, illuminated hydroponic farming systems. And Gary Wozniak's idea is that these will become laboratories for these LED farms. And I mean, like I said to him, why do you need a whole building to test it? You test it in a room of one of them. But somehow that doesn't feature in the mentality of this thing. And just 2 months ago, or a month ago, in Amsterdam, everybody was talking about the fact that this Dutch company that does LED lights had been to Detroit, looking at some buildings where they want to try and install their systems. So whether it will happen, who knows, but there's this kind of odd, like almost relentless, it's not really momentum, but it's just like this constant activity that remains in the city with people trying to push these ideas. Now, the ones who have pushed something, which are probably the most kind of uncertain of the sort of players in this area, is an organization called Hunts. And actually what's very interesting is this is from today, and it's called Hunts Woodlands. When you looked at that about 6 months ago, it was called Hunts Farms. And Hunts is a local resident, an individual who operates a investment company of some sort. And he'd set up this proposal called Hunts Farms, which was again to introduce urban agriculture into the city and to introduce urban farming and to make the city productive. And there's been a long, long protracted negotiation with the city to introduce these farms, which has resulted in not land for farming, but land for forestry. And I can't quite remember the figures, but again, at this meeting in Amsterdam, we had some people who were familiar with what's going on in Detroit talking about this and saying that just in the last month or two, the city has sold land now to Hunts Farms at a very, very low price. They're going to introduce forestry, not agriculture, and apparently, and again, I may not have the figures quite right, but the commitment is 5 years to sort of maintain the land as forestry land. Now, the land at the moment is so cheap that it's almost being given away. And yet, we saw from those earlier photographs, there's still this whole kind of infrastructure in place. So if the place does regenerate and take off, the question is really what's the intention behind Hunts Farms, who've suddenly got all this land in a suburban area that is serviced. Yeah. So that's the big question, I think, for Detroit in respect of urban agriculture. One of the big questions. I think I should just wrap up. Yeah. Did I quickly finish this about something? I'll just quickly. Okay. I'll just very quickly say about somewhere else, where things are happening actually quite differently, but is a very, very significant movement in relation to this idea of productivity, the productive city, but also the kind of politics of it. So this is now, we're in a city called Milwaukee. Again, this sort of one of these sort of Rust Belt cities, kind of suffered from deindustrialization, but still relatively intact. And this person, his name is Will Allen, and he has set up something called Growing Power, which is a very influential organization which advocates urban agriculture. He set up this farm, very basic but very productive, which operates in Milwaukee, and this is the front of it. And he basically trains people in farming. He's setting up a whole number of sites. But alongside that, he runs an annual conference, which is called the Growing Food, Growing Power Conference, which is basically a Black American political kind of activist organization, sort of an empowerment organization. And he brings together this huge kind of constituency of people who are coming partly from food and partly from a sort of an engagement perspective. And that's probably the hidden side of a lot of the urban agriculture work in the States, because like in Detroit, if you just dig a little bit below the surface, you discover that it's very, very political. I mean, the reason why people are engaging, I mean, political in a sort of large sense, in relation to disenfranchisement, African American population, seeing this as a kind of a marker for a form of resistance, you could say. But at the same time as that's happening, Will Allen is kind of working with everyone. So he operates this kind of open table policy, where in terms of the food growing, he's working with organizations like these people, Cisco, who would be a bit like our Tesco. I mean, they supply school meals in the States, and their environmental credentials are not very high. But Will Allen has set up this site, which is behind us, is one of the factories where they produce these foods. And he's growing all of these crops with his staff organically, and the produce will be used by Cisco. And he's also, Will Allen, has got $1 million grant from Walmart to build a vertical farm, a very small one. And what's interesting about that is that he will get support from anybody who will give it, provided they don't set the terms sort of his engagement. And that's where I will leave it. Okay.